Alright, time to make another video. Apologies for it being late. So let's talk about something, and that's the need for a standardized language, or a standard one. Now, when you think of language, there are several you could possibly have in mind. Obviously, the first one you learn, or the second, or the third. And many languages that you don't. For example, I speak English. I'm sure many of the people watching do as well, considering, well, I'm doing this channel in English. Last time I checked, I'm not speaking in Latin. Nunc pagamos. I butchered that. Regardless. The reality is, when it comes to language, we need it to communicate. If there are two people, let's say person A and person B, and person A knows English, but person B knows French, well, then they're going to have issues. Because fundamentally, they don't speak the same language. And sure, French and English have similarities, but they are not exact copies, and so naturally, the communication won't be as effective. Now, internally within countries, this is less of a problem. For example, take the United Kingdom. It's a big country, and mostly speaks English. I say mostly both for the fact that, one, I drew this very poorly. This was supposed to be Scotland, but regardless. The United Kingdom, centered around London, has many peoples who speak English. And so, naturally, with a lot of people speaking English, you have a very easy way to communicate, because someone in London and someone up here could easily communicate. Someone in Perth, say, or even Cornwall, could understand each other. And as a result, communication between these areas is simple. I could easily write a letter from one place to the other and perfectly be understood by the person receiving it. Unless, of course, you have the cases of migration, but that's another matter. And as a result, this allows for more efficiency. Because fundamentally, if you can understand a person, you don't need to spend as much time translating and can instead focus on communication. This is especially important for, well, businesses. After all, a lot of business is organization, making sure everything is arranged, everything's filed, keeping track of profits and losses, etc. Fundamentally, having a shared language makes things easier. Friendship, it also helps because you don't have to constantly translate what they're saying and worry about cultural context, and so many more. Diplomacy, too, for states, is also far easier with a standard language to go between. But here's the problem. A lot of countries like to focus on only their own languages. So, for example, in France, you're taught French. In Germany, you're taught German. Spain, you're taught Spanish, etc. Now, Europe in particular is a lot less severe on this fact because, well, they're surrounded by many peoples who speak many different languages, so they're actually fairly good at teaching people a number of languages. But even still, there are issues. For one, it's just the fact that, well, the Europeans can only teach so many languages, and, well, there's quite a few members of the states that make up the EU. For example, of the 4 states I've drawn, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, how many languages do you think are spoken across all of them? 3. Dutch, up here, in the Netherlands, along with Flanders. French in both southern Belgium, also known as Wallonia, and France itself. Then you have Occitanian, down here, to a lesser extent. And of course, there's small pockets of German and Italian due to the borders. And so, naturally, if a person who knows French and Dutch attempts to communicate with an Occitanian, they're going to have issues. And that's where we need a standard language. Because this is just neighbors who've been working towards this. But what happens if we were to say, take this to Africa? Again, this will be a rough sketch of Africa because I am notoriously very bad at drawing. But the basic idea should do, and hopefully I don't make the horn look too bad. Worse enough. But with Africa, there are many different peoples and many different languages. In fact, some of the most diverse cultures exist in the continent. And as a result, if you wanted to do a situation where you have people learning multiple languages in an attempt to communicate without one being a standard overriding language that everyone can speak, you're going to have many issues. Which is why, for example, Nigeria uses English. Because, yes, the Nigerians are many different tribes and peoples who have their own languages, cultures, and customs. But every one of them was ruled by the British. So every one of them had to go to schools that taught English, and thus, English became a very effective go-between language for every people. You could be Igbo, you could be any number of tribes or cultures, you could still understand English. And thus, communication became simple. India, too, had this similar thing. There were so many languages across the entirety of the subcontinent that using them all would be inefficient. So they had their own language that was local, that they could all understand, but also they continued to use English because, well, that's what the British taught their people when they established schools and education there. And it thus made things far more efficient. And so a universal standard language would be advised. Now, plenty of people have considered this, and when I disagreed with one of them, they proposed instead for people to learn the 5 main languages: English, Spanish, Mandarin, and 2 others, likely French and some 5th one. Probably Arabic. I forget. Regardless, that was the initial proposal. And yes, if we had several languages that were mainly used, like English, Spanish, Mandarin, Chinese, French, and Arabic, sure, that would help, because at least you have some languages that everyone knows. But the issue is, 1, that's a lot of languages to learn. I mean, think about it. It's one thing to go from English to French, or English to Spanish. Yes, they're a different group, but they borrow several words, and they are very close. Even going from a transition of English to Russian, there's some overlap. Not much, and it's a whole new alphabet, but still, some. Learning 5 languages, or even 3 of these, is going to be difficult because there are 3 different alphabets here. These 3 use the Latin alphabet, based firmly in the Latin script which the Romans had. The Arabs have their own script. And of course, Chinese characters are their own. In fact, Chinese characters have inspired a lot of people in East Asia, so a Japanese to Mandarin transition will be a lot easier because they share several letters. But that's the thing. Sure, for local transitions, it would work, but learning 5 would be insanely difficult and extremely impractical, especially with the differences in alphabets between the 5 main languages, which is why we need a single standard one. If someone speaks Spanish and French and other Arabic and Mandarin, if they all know another language, say English, then communication becomes very easy. Because you just speak in English. That's what you understand, so you speak it. In fact, in the American Revolution, a similar thing happened, but with French. Because French was the language of haute culture, and many other factors of, well, basically existence at the time, due to it being the lingua franca of the time. Since that, what happened was, when dealing with 2 people who spoke different languages, like Alexander Hamilton and von Steuben, they may have spoken different languages. One may speak English and the other German, but they both knew French, and so were able to use it as a go-between. And that helped with communication and planning the revolution. Because even during a war, or rather especially during a war, by having something that you can use as a go-between language to communicate between many different parties from many different places, it allows for not just efficiency, but effective communication. And that's important, especially because it decreases unrest. You may ask why. What would knowing different languages have to do with unrest? But think about it with an example from the Horn of Africa. Somalis speak their own language. They have their own cultures, customs, etc. Now, the Somali peoples have their own beliefs, and especially have their own claims. But what happens when the Amharans and Oromos disagree with those claims? Well, they're gonna start fighting. And if you want to calm things down, let's say you're a diplomat sent down there, it would be very difficult to calm things down when you have to constantly speak different languages. So if you instead had English as a language they both understood, then you're more able to resolve tensions and thus ensure peace. Through this, you can effectively maintain stability, because if everyone speaks the same language, then everyone can understand when overtures are made to reduce violence. And that is good. A very good thing. Observe bad drawings, but still. The base idea is fundamentally that when you have different peoples with different languages, you're going to have disagreements. And the best way to resolve that is to have one language that everyone knows, so that everyone can communicate and effectively work together. If everyone in the world who knew a language knew at least English, then you would ensure that everyone could communicate with each other when needed. Because otherwise, people turn to the universal language. And I know a lot of people, those romantics and just general bleeding hearts, like to say, oh, it's love. No. Force is the universal language. Yes, romance is something that is experienced between many peoples and many cultures. But tell me, do you think the practices that the Japanese have in regards to romance, relationships, and eventually sexual intimacy are the same as an American who speaks English? Or a Frenchman? Or an African tribal? Do you honestly think those are the exact same across all cultures? No. Last time I checked, Americans aren't cutting into their skin to insert pieces of rock into them that grow out and make their lips bigger. That's something done only for certain people in certain areas in Africa. That is their culture and part of their traditions in relation to beauty and intimacy. Because yes, that is considered beautiful for some freaking reason. Don't understand it, frankly don't want to. But the fact is, when it comes down to it, love, romance, all those things associated with it, they are all fundamentally not the same across cultures. Yes, people can learn cultures. They can learn these things and eventually have relationships. But if you're looking at a person and saying, I like him, I don't understand what he's saying or what he believes, but I like him, that's not a relationship built on romance. You have a one-sided crush. You're not understanding the person, you're just looking and saying, I like him, he looks good. Or I like her, she looks good. That's not a romantic relationship. Romance, love, they are not a universal language. They can never be, because how it's expressed is different across all peoples. But force, now that is understood. If I point a gun at your head, you understand exactly what it means. Do or else, or I'm gonna kill you. Pretty easy translation there. If I pull a sword, I am going to use it, or try to bluff with it. No matter what, force is understood as, if you do what I say, you don't get hurt. Or if you do as I suggest, you don't get hurt. If you don't, or I feel like doing it, you get hurt. It is not a complicated subject, and so everyone can understand it. When the U.S. pulled up in Japan and said, open the borders, or specifically, make sure you don't kill our people for daring to step on your island after, their boats sank, well, guess what? How did they understand? Well, one, they had some translations, but two, importantly, they sent ships into the bay with guns, and they sent a white flag to the administrator that they were talking to that says, use this if you wish to surrender. Essentially, do or else. Force was understood, despite these being two different peoples from two very different histories. And if we don't have unrest reduced by a standard language, the universal language is what is going to come out. That is what's going to be used. The standard language is not and should never be seen as a replacement for all other languages, but rather a way to preserve them while effectively managing society. Think of it like a wheel with spokes. You can have all different languages here. All of them, different wheels, different spokes, but a part of the same wheel, communication. All with their own purposes. And fundamentally, with their own beliefs and cultural traditions attached. Because language carries a lot of culture. There can be no question there. But a single standard language is the centerpiece of it, allowing those peoples from disparate beliefs, different cultures, different areas, and different times to some extent, to communicate with each other without worry. They can work together more efficiently, they can reduce unrest because they can understand each other, and they can cooperate. You cannot have dialogue, fundamentally, if you don't speak that person's language, if you don't understand where they're coming from. English, French, Spanish, whatever you want to use. I'm favorable to English, go figure, I'm an American. But whatever you want to use, you need both sides to understand it, otherwise you can't have dialogue. You can't negotiate with someone who doesn't speak your language. Because what's there to negotiate? If you don't understand them and they don't understand you, any demand you make, any suggestion you make, and anything they propose instead, is something you can't understand. If they ask for $200, how are you going to know if you don't speak that language? You may say translators, to which I ask, translators going to be in good faith? Maybe, maybe not. And even if they are, also I forgot something, even if they are, it's a giant waste that requires a lot of problems, because when you are relying on a third party to translate, not only is there the risk of them just straight up lying to you, there's also just the fact that when you're using different things get lost. So, for example, if I speak English and someone else is speaking Pidgin, say, don't speak the language, don't know much about it, but if someone's speaking Pidgin and I'm speaking English, well, guess what? Even if someone's there to translate between us, certain phrases, certain ways of understanding are unique to that language. For example, in Spanish, the way things are organized is different. Sopa de pollo. Chicken soup. Directly translated, it's soup of chicken. And you see already, the entire structure is different. A direct literal translation, which a translator could do, is going to be, 1, time-consuming, and 2, impractical. But if everyone's speaking English, or everyone's speaking Spanish, well then communication becomes a lot easier because, fundamentally, everyone's working within the same wheelhouse. They're working within the same framework, the same wheel. And so everything can go a lot smoother. And that's where a standard language comes in. Now, one may debate on which one it is. I would advise English for several reasons. 1, American. 2, the U.S. is busy leading the world economically. And 3, let's face it, we've had hundreds of years, literal centuries of Anglo dominance. A lot of people already speak it. Heck, India uses it as a go-between language already. The United States has 300 million people that use it. And let's face it, most of Europe also understands the language. It'd just be easier. But regardless on which one we decide, we should have one. Heck, even Mandarin would be something. Arabic would be too, so long as it exists and everyone understands it. Sure, naturally, when I say everyone, you can't have 100%. I would prefer it, but there's always going to be those people who only want to learn one language that happens to be their own. That's just how people are going to be. But if we can get as many people as possible to understand it, to speak it, then that standard language serves its role. a go-between between many different people's ideas and positions. Some accommodations may have to be needed due to cultural beliefs, but in the end, the fundamental structure and the fundamental language should exist. We should have a standard language to be used, both for our own countries, like, for example, the United States should have everyone knowing English, and for the world stage. If it turns out to be English, great. If it turns out to be even some other language, fine. But it should be there. Things do not get better when people can't understand each other. Because if they can't understand, they can't cooperate. They can't cooperate, they achieve nothing. And if they achieve nothing, unrest grows, people get hatred, and they start making excuses for why things are going bad. Because guess what? People don't take kindly to things going bad, and if they can't work things out by talking to each other, well, they're just going to talk with a gun. Or a knife. Or who knows, maybe a fridge. It won't be pretty. And so, for the sake of practicality, efficiency, reducing unrest, and ensuring stability for the rest of our time, we should have a standard language. That'll be all. Thank you for watching.